Thank you for asking me to come and speak about this. I entitled my remarks, "My Parents Never Spoke of It." As a child, I had a recurring nightmare. I was being chased, and I was terrified. I would find myself in front of two chutes. The mouths resembled the faces of a Greek tragicomedy mask. I could choose either the frown or the smile. Now, being chased by demons, witches, or lions is not uncommon, but my dreams were unique. You see, whatever chute I picked, at the bottom, someone would be waiting with a branding iron to tattoo me. If I spelled my name quickly enough, I would wake up and be saved. I never asked my mother about the blue numbers that the Nazis tattooed on her arm, and she never spoke of it. When I was a teenager, she had the numbers removed, but I knew what the scar covered up. Although neither of my parents talked about the Holocaust, I knew that they had endured unspeakable horrors. I knew I had no grandparents. Once a year, my parents lit candles in memory of their parents and siblings. My 3 siblings and I were named after some of these deceased relatives. This was the Jewish tradition. But I knew nothing about why so many family members were lost, why there were so many candles to light. I never asked because I always sensed the Holocaust was taboo. As I grew older, I learned about the Holocaust in Hebrew school. I vividly remember the awful pictures of the jammed cattle cars filled with people, heaps of dead bodies, and near-dead, emaciated men and women who the Allies found when they liberated the concentration camps. I learned then that all 4 of my grandparents and many of my aunts, uncles, and cousins were among the 1.1 million Jews murdered at the killing center of Auschwitz-Birkenau. I remember feeling overwhelmed by an immense source of sadness and horror, imagining my parents in these cattle cars and in those concentration camp barracks. I felt anger that mankind had allowed this to happen. I did not ask my parents about what they personally experienced, but I knew that they had endured unspeakable horrors and had suffered enormously, and I vowed to bring them only joy. As a teenager, when many of my friends were rebelling against their parents, I actually prayed every night before I went to sleep that I would always be a source of pride and happiness for them because my parents had endured enough sadness and horror to last a lifetime. In 1980, my younger sister wrote her master's thesis on children of Holocaust survivors. Her research pointed to recurring themes in these children that I could identify with. A feeling of loss in terms of a diminished family circle, and a sense of guilt in acting in any way that might cause my parents grief. I have read more recent studies confirming that many children of Holocaust survivors like me had terrible nightmares growing up in which they were chased, persecuted, and tortured. As adults, many continue to suffer from debilitating anxiety and depression. Some have apparently internalized the Holocaust trauma of their parents, a form of PTSD. The studies show that many survivors and their children demonstrate increased vulnerability to anxiety, but interestingly, also extraordinary resilience. I firmly believe that the resilience gene I inherited probably saved my life. At age 52, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia and given 4 months to live. For the next 3 years, I underwent many rounds of chemotherapy and ultimately a life-saving stem cell transplant. I distinctly remember lying in my hospital bed, struggling to stay alive after my kidneys stopped functioning. I truly felt the shadow of death. But I was able to muster new strength by remembering what my parents had endured. Unlike me, they had every reason to give up hope. They had lost their loved ones and were surrounded by people who wanted to torture and kill them. I was in a place where everyone was trying to save me. I was surrounded by family who loved and encouraged me. I had so much to live for. Surely I could fight this. Plus, I really could not bear the thought of my parents having to endure the death of yet another loved one. It was not until after both my parents passed away that I finally learned their stories. In the mid-1990s, my parents were among the 50,000 Holocaust survivors and eyewitnesses who gave their testimony to the survivors of the Shoah Foundation. Shoah is the Hebrew word for Holocaust that means catastrophe. This was a project spearheaded by Steven Spielberg, who produced one of the more poignant accounts of the Holocaust, Schindler's List. My parents never let us watch those tapes. It was only after my father passed away in 2010 that I found the recordings in their home. In the last few years before he died, my father volunteered to visit schools, like I am doing today, to tell his stories. Indeed, he visited a school just 2 weeks before he passed away, but I never attended or even spoke about his talks, because for me, the subject of the Holocaust was still taboo. But my mother and father are gone now. There are very few Holocaust survivors left to tell their stories. We can read the hundreds of books about the Holocaust. We can try to absorb the data. 6 million Jews perished. 2/3 of the Jews in Europe were killed by the Nazis and their collaborators, including 94% of the Jews of Lithuania, 90% of the Jews of Poland, 80% of the Jews of Slovakia and Yugoslavia and Greece. 1/3 of the Jews in the entire world were annihilated. Just imagine 1/3 of all members of a religious, racial, or ethnic group, perhaps your own, being targeted, persecuted, and systematically murdered. Nazi Germany was a modern, technologically advanced nation that engaged in a campaign to kill every Jew, man, woman, and child in Europe. In January of 1942, the final solution, the genocidal plot, was launched. The enormity of these figures is simply too great to comprehend. 6 million is an abstract number that numbs rather than sensitizes. I remember trying to explain it to my law students this way. I told them to imagine that every one of their Jewish professors and friends, as well as their entire families, were all systematically rounded up and murdered. Indeed, every single Jew in the United States. You see, the Jewish population in this country today is about 6 million. So just imagine every Jewish politician, journalist, jurist, comedian, actor, director, poet, scientist in the United States. Every one of them would be condemned to die. This can only begin to capture the Holocaust, the mass slaughter and persecution of the Jewish people. I have come to believe that it is only through personal stories that this tragedy can begin to be understood, and that children of Holocaust survivors, like myself, are uniquely situated to do this. By telling our parents' personal stories, we can show that the victims of the Holocaust were real people who had real lives that were utterly destroyed by the Holocaust, solely because of their Jewish heritage. 6 million individuals, men, women, and over 1 million children died. Those few who survived, like my parents, were subjected to unspeakable horrors that tragically affected not only their own lives, but also the lives of their children. Some of the children, like my older sister Margaret, were born soon after the war in refugee camps in Europe to parents who were physically and emotionally damaged, who had just lost most of their family and whose futures were uncertain. Not too surprisingly, the studies show that many of these children suffered from phobias and other serious psychological problems. It has taken me many years to address the it my parents never spoke about, but now more than ever, the it needs to be retold and discussed. Sadly, the Holocaust did not end genocide and ethnic cleansing. Kosovo, Bosnia, Myanmar, Darfur, Rwanda demonstrate this. The human motivations that helped create the Holocaust, fear, envy, sadism, hatred, and ignorance, are still present and on the rise. Today, we live in a toxic environment where hatred and bigotry are all too prevalent. We all just witnessed the horrific attack on the Capitol, carrying Confederate flags and sporting T-shirts with the words Camp Auschwitz and 6MWE, which stands for 6 million wasn't enough. Over the past few years, acts of anti-Semitism have surged in the United States and throughout the world. In 2019, the Anti-Defamation League reported the highest number in 40 years. Over 2,000 incidents in this country against Jews and Jewish institutions. On average, 6 anti-Semitic incidents occurred every day in the United States. Jews were the target of over 60% of all religious hate crimes, even though Jews make up only 2% of the population in America. The attacks have become not only more numerous, but also more virulent. In 2017, at the alt-right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, white supremacists gave Nazi salutes, wore swastika pins, waved swastika flags, and carried signs declaring Jews are Satan's children. On October 27, 2018, we witnessed the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in this country's history. A gunman walked into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and opened fire on worshipers, killing 11 and wounding several others while shouting the words, "All Jews must die." In April 2019, the Chabad religious community in California was targeted. 1 worshiper was killed and 3 others wounded. A few months later, 6 people were killed in an attack on a Jewish supermarket in New Jersey. And in the first 2 weeks of December, there were 9 anti-Semitic attacks in New York. The worst involved a man who broke into a rabbi's home and stabbed 5 people at a Hanukkah party. The internet has clearly fueled the viral spread of hate. In 2019, over 4 million anti-Semitic tweets were reported. Now, Jews, of course, were not the only victims of this surge in hate. The FBI reported 7,300 incidents in 2019, targeting Muslims, Jews, blacks, and the LGBTQ community. The number of hate crimes in grades K through 12 doubled. The number of hate groups increased by 30%. Cyberspace has indeed proven to be an effective recruiting tool for these groups, most organized around the ideology of white supremacy. White supremacist incidents on college campuses tripled last year. A 2020 poll of Americans ages 18 to 39 revealed that 22% had never heard of the Holocaust. 30% were unaware of Hitler's attempt to exterminate the Jews of Europe. 31% believed that less than 2 million Jews were killed. Elie Wiesel, one of the most eloquent spokespersons for the need to speak out against all forms of hatred, described the Holocaust this way, and I quote, "On the one side, there were the executioners, and on the other, the victims. But what about the onlookers, those who remained neutral, those who served the executioner by simply not interfering?" Complacency towards hate and discrimination emboldens it. Telling my parents' story is honoring their memory and ending my own complacency. So here are their stories. Both of my parents came from a small village in what was eastern Czechoslovakia. They came from large families with many sisters and brothers and aunts, uncles, and cousins. My mother was raised on a farm with a flour mill that had been in the family for generations. My father's family had 300 acres of land, some of it used for farming, but most to provide lumber for their timber business. They were both raised in Orthodox Jewish homes, and their families each built synagogues on their property that were the center of religious life in their communities. What you see on the screen is my father telling his story for the Shoah Foundation, and now I will recount his words. My father says that education, including religious education, was stressed in his family. At the tender age of 3, he began Hebrew school. The Sabbath and Jewish festivities were joyous events with extended family. There was lots of singing and dancing. My grandparents always invited the poor to come and partake. At age 11, my father left home to attend the Gymnasium Ivrit, a highly respected Jewish school, well known for its learned rabbis and rigorous standards. 6 years later, a mere 6 years later, in 1938, he was forced to leave school. In September of that year, Germany seized the western portion of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and in November, it turned over the eastern part where my parents lived to Hungary. Soon after my father returned home from school, the Jews were required to wear yellow armbands so they could be easily identified. Jews were targeted for harassment and beatings in the streets. Hungarian police would randomly visit Jewish homes to beat up family members for no reason. German records document that during the summer of 1941, 20,000 Jews from the region were rounded up and shipped to Poland, where they were machine gunned and buried in mass graves. Jewish soldiers who fled the Polish army told my parents' family about the mass deportation of Polish Jews, but no one had any idea of the magnitude of the persecution. In the September of 1943, my father, who had just turned 21, was conscripted into the Hungarian army. Like all young, able-bodied Jews of this region, he was assigned to a slave labor camp, the Arbeit, work battalion. He dug trenches, planted mines, and built military bunkers for 15 hours every day. Many young men were killed planting the mines. My dad recounted his own close brush with death. Food was meager, and the punishment was swift and cruel for anyone who became sick or who couldn't keep up. He was hung by his feet and beaten until he lost consciousness, then splashed with ice-cold water and beaten again. In the spring of 1944, the German Gestapo arrived. They loaded my father's platoon into boxcars headed for Poland. In the process, an SS soldier ordered my father to stand in the doorway of the boxcar while he sadistically slammed the door on his face, permanently blinding him in his left eye. Upon arriving in Poland, the battalion was assigned to build bridges. Their daily food consisted of soup made from potato scraps and a tiny piece of black bread. In the fall of 1944, as our Russian allies began to close in, the SS transported the remnants of my father's brigade to the Austria-Hungary border. There they were forced to sleep outside. Anyone caught trying to find warmth in the barn where the cattle were kept was immediately shot. By winter, over half the young men, including my father, had contracted typhus, and almost half of the infected men died from the disease. All suffered from severe malnutrition and frostbite. As the Russians continued to advance, the SS forced the men to march again, this time to Vienna. My father recounts how a few Viennese, in unusual display of courage and compassion, threw down bread from their apartment windows as the emaciated Jewish men marched through the streets. The Gestapo fired at the windows of these righteous Gentiles and shot and killed any Jew who tried to pick up a morsel of bread. It was not uncommon for the SS to randomly pick 20 to 25 of my father's platoon, require them to dig their own graves, and then shoot them. And as they marched, they encountered Hitler Jugend, young teens indoctrinated to believe that Jews were no different than rats who needed to be exterminated. These gangs would stop the men, beat them, and sometimes kill them. Finally, in late March of 1945, they arrived at their destination, Mauthausen, a concentration camp in Austria. There was absolutely no food. My father saw only skeletons. He subsisted on tree bark, grass, and puddles. He watched men and women fall into the latrines and die and drowned from starvation and exhaustion. But the suffering didn't end there. As the Allies closed in, the Nazis forced the remaining 60,000 men and women at Mauthausen to evacuate. This was later dubbed the Death March, one of many the Nazis imposed on their victims. More than half of the men and women could not keep up, and they were shot. My father would have been one of them. He could no longer walk, which meant certain death. Another Jewish man, a total stranger to him, somehow mustered the strength to pick him up and carry him on his back all the way to the next camp. In April of 1945, just weeks before the end of the war, my father arrived in Gunskirchen, a newly constructed concentration camp in Austria. Nazi records confirm that 18,000 men and women were shoved into barracks intended to house 300 people. They were given no food. Dozens died daily from disease and starvation. The Nazis would deliver a small supply of water twice a week, but when the few men strong enough to walk tried to retrieve it, the SS would shoot at them. My father's closest friend from his hometown was killed just 4 days before the liberation, trying to get a drink of water. Until the bitter end, the SS continued to take pleasure in randomly torturing and shooting at the Jews. My father recounts that when the end was imminent, the Red Cross sent packages intended to sustain the prisoners of the camp. But the Germans kept the food and sadistically gave the men the tooth powder. I have read the report and I've seen the photos taken by the U.S. battalion that liberated Gunskirchen. It describes in a quote, an absolute hellhole with sick, insane, dying skeletons, bodies lying 3 deep, some alive, but most dead. By this point, my father was too ill to remember much, but he vividly recalls looking up from his bed and seeing Jewish men carrying guns. The SS was nowhere to be seen. It was May 4th, 1945, my father's Liberation Day. He was taken to a hastily constructed Red Cross hospital near Vienna, where he was deloused and treated for malnutrition. He lost over half of his body weight. A few weeks later, the Czech government sent trucks to Vienna to collect Czech nationals like my father and return them to their homes, but my father had no home. A Russian family was living in his house, and Russian authorities refused to intervene on his behalf. And it was then that my father learned that both his parents, his sister, her husband, and their 2 young boys, as well as numerous aunts, uncles, and cousins, had perished at Auschwitz. Shortly after returning home, my father found my mother. They met before the war when my father was 15 and my mother was 12. They performed in a play together, and my father often said he fell in love with her at first sight. He was elated that she was a man among the few of their village who had survived. This is my mother telling her story that I will now recount. My mother describes her childhood as idyllic and innocent. She was the youngest of 5, 3 older brothers and sisters. Because of the large age gap between herself and her siblings, she readily admits that she was spoiled. In particular, she had a special relationship with her father, who doted on her. Her older brother, Daniel, moved back into the home, together with his wife and 2 young children, to help run the family's business. Daniel's son and daughter were my mother's companions, and they filled the home with laughter and happiness. My mother's oldest sister, Esther, married and had 4 little girls, and they all came together to celebrate Jewish holidays. Every Sabbath was joyful, filled with singing and dancing. My mother said she saw no anti-Semitism as a child. She recounts that Jews got along well with their Christian neighbors. My grandfather was loving and generous to everyone. My mother recalls when he arranged and paid for the funeral of a poor Christian neighbor, and all the children played together in public school. But all of this came to an abrupt halt in 1939, when Nazi-controlled Hungary occupied her village. My mother had just turned 14. Everyone was forced to wear yellow armbands and later Stars of David. The Jewish children, like my mother, were kicked out of the public schools. Jews were not allowed to own businesses or to go in any public places. There were rumors about Jews being persecuted and deported, but my mother's father assured her that they had nothing to fear. This would all blow over like the many pogroms, the organized Jewish massacre of Jews that erupted from time to time in Russia and throughout Eastern Europe. She specifically remembers her father telling her that as long as FDR was the President of the United States, nothing bad would happen to the law-abiding, respectable members of the Jewish community. Only after the war did she learn that in June of 1939, the SS St. Louis, a ship carrying 1,000 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, was turned away by this country, as well as by Canada and by Cuba. Those refugees were forced to return to Europe, where they faced certain death. In 1941, my mother's beloved brother Daniel was conscripted into the Hungarian army. Shortly thereafter, the family received a postcard informing them that Daniel was missing in action. Shortly thereafter, she learned, and this was really closer to after the war, that her brother, together with over 100 other young Jewish men, was forced into a barn that the Hungarian Gestapo set afire, burning to death all the occupants. For my mother, the real nightmare began in April 1944. She was 18 years old. She and her family were leaving the synagogue after Passover services. Hungarian soldiers ordered them back into the synagogue, where they spent the night. The next morning, without allowing them to go home to retrieve any belongings, they were transported to a red brick factory a few miles away. They remained there for several weeks, sleeping on concrete floors with no bathroom facilities, barely enough food to survive, and no explanation of what was going to happen to them. My mother remembers the constant din of crying and wailing. At one point, my mother's parents tried to escape with their 2 grandchildren. They had heard that the young, able-bodied adults and teenagers, like my mother, would be sent to work for the Nazis, but that the elderly and the children would be killed. They, of course, were caught and returned that same night. My grandfather severely beaten. My mother remembers that this was the moment that she entered into a state of shock and numbness that would continue throughout her ordeal. After a few weeks, the transportation from the red brick factories to Auschwitz began. Nazi records, in fact, document that over the last 10 days of May 1944, 29,000 Jews from this region were loaded into 9 cattle cars, about 3,000 in each. My mother recounts that they were given no food and only 1 bucket of water per boxcar. There was no place to relieve oneself, nor barely enough food to breathe. My mother later learned that her grandmother was among the hundreds who perished in these boxcars. After a hellish 3-day journey, they arrived in Auschwitz. My mother described the overwhelming stench of burning flesh from the crematoria and from large outside fires where bodies were being tossed because there were too many people for the ovens to handle. She watched in horror as Jews were thrown alive into the ovens because the gas chambers were full. The sound of people screaming out in agony never ended. My mother also remembered seeing the infamous Dr. Mengele, the so-called angel of death, notorious for performing cruel medical experiments on his victims. He was waiting on that platform, and he directed the new arrivals to proceed to the right or the left. My mother saw her own mother, her sister-in-law, and her precious niece and nephew, her childhood companions, directed to the left. They were gassed and cremated that same day. My mother and her older sister were directed to the right. She was warned to never acknowledge the relationship because experimentation on siblings was one of Dr. Mengele's evil specialties. The next morning, my mother was stripped of her identity as a person. She became the number tattooed on her arm. Her head was shaved, and she and 17 other young women were taken to Birkenau, the death camp annex of Auschwitz. Their job was to sort through the massive piles of clothing and jewelry taken from the Jewish victims before they entered the gas chambers. My mother was horrified to find her mother's dress, confirming what she already knew, that her mother had perished. These 18 girls were always hungry and terribly frightened. The Nazis made sure of this. They forced the girls to watch the hanging of 14 young Jewish women who were screaming out in agony. The purpose was to teach the girls to behave and obey, or this would be their fate. Another time, they were taken to watch the beards being ripped off the faces of rabbis, whose limbs were then torn off. These displays of shocking, barbaric cruelty formed the nightmares that haunted my mother throughout her life. At one point, she saw her father from afar in the camp, but she was too frightened to acknowledge him. Any infraction triggered cruel punishment or death. Her sister was severely beaten when she tried to shake the lice out of their blankets. My mother and her sister remained in Auschwitz an agonizing 8 months until January 1945, when the SS began to evacuate the camp. The inmates were forced to march through Poland in the freezing snow and ice with no coats or boots. During the journey, literally thousands died of starvation and illness. And my mother later learned that, in fact, her beloved father was among those who were shot because he simply couldn't keep up. The remnants who survived were taken to another infamous concentration camp, Ravensbrück, 50 miles north of Berlin. It was known as the Crazy House because many occupants, mostly women, had gone insane in the camp. They were kept in cages. Lice and disease were everywhere. My mother was told that no one left Ravensbrück alive. Miraculously, she and her sister were among a select few women who were chosen to work in a German airplane factory near Hamburg. They were boarded into crowded cattle cars, and when the cars stopped to pick up others, some of the women would jump off to relieve themselves. Once the train started, anyone still on the ground was shot. My mother would have been one of them, but for the outstretched arm of a stranger who pulled her back on board just in the nick of time. My mother worked in the factory until her liberation by the Russians on May 8, 1945. She remembered one day waking up and seeing the watchtowers empty and then watching the Germans surrender their guns. Unlike the American soldiers who liberated my father, the Russian soldiers offered the survivors little help. To the contrary, some of the young women were raped by their liberators. My mother quickly piled her sister, who was deathly ill from typhoid, into a wheelbarrow, and she began the month-long journey walking home. Both were severely physically and emotionally damaged. The hope of finding family was the only thing that kept them alive. Finally, they crossed the border into Czechoslovakia and made their way to their hometown. It was then that my mother learned that most of her beautiful family was gone. In addition to her parents, her grandmother, her brother Daniel, his wife, and 2 children, she learned that her older sister Esther, Esther's husband, and their 4 little girls were all murdered. The Russians had seized their home, and she was unable to retrieve even a single photograph of her parents and siblings. Her past had truly been obliterated. My parents' stories painfully demonstrate the human capacity for extreme, unspeakable evil. I hope that hearing these stories will strengthen your resolve to show greater respect and compassion for those who are the target of hate in our world today, and that you will speak out so that the it will never happen again. I hope you will also learn from my parents' story a lesson in perseverance and resilience. My parents were teenagers like you when the Nazis invaded and destroyed their lives. Despite the unspeakable horrors they experienced, they were able to start over, to marry, to have a family, and to provide a loving home for their children. They did not allow hatred, bitterness, and revenge to dominate their lives. They rose above it. Their strength and their courage continue to inspire me. I hope they will inspire you. Thank you for listening.